All right, folks, the second part of Unit 6 here, talking specifically about conservatism and liberalism and radicalism and other isms as we go down the page. And remember that this whole unit, really, the age of isms, is the notion that ideas are trying to pull Europe in certain directions. After the French Revolution really ends with the defeat of Napoleon, you're looking at a Europe that's really not sure as to where it's going to go. And there are forces of the old world that want to pull it in one direction, and forces of the new world that want to pull it slightly to the left, and then there are others who want to pull it a long way to the left. So let's start all the way on the right with the conservatives and more our way down that column. Conservatism would say, and in each of those I'm going to try to give as full throat of the defense as I can for the idea. Conservatives would argue that their system works. And the reason it works is because we've had it for hundreds of years. And prior to that whole business of 1789 and the French Revolution, things worked out. If you have a monarch and a nobility and a clergy, and that is to say a society run around the pillars, the society is going to be stable. Now, it may not give equality to every human being in there, but there's only a certain amount of stability that you can have with that slippery slope of equality. You start limiting the rights of the monarch and you're going to head to chaos. You need proof of it? Look at the French Revolution. You start putting the shackles on the church and the shackles on the nobility, and you get rid of the king, chaos. Look at the English Civil War, 1649. They execute the king. They get rid of the idea of a king. You suddenly have this government where there's no monarch. And how does it go? Horribly under Cromwell. Now, a conservative would argue that that is proof positive, that you need those pillars of society. The conservative we list here is Edmund Burke, the English conservative, who would argue that the French Revolution is, if nothing else, a great case scenario of failure. You need proof that conservatism works? Look at that. Look at how bad things went without the conservative pillars. Oh yeah, we should get rid of the nobility. Yeah, good idea. See how that goes for you. Okay, so I know I exaggerate, but I'm trying to make it as strong as possible here. We talked about the Decembrist movement when we were talking about conservatism. So to put that in a capsule here, the Decembrist movement happens in Russia, which we should point out is a very, very conservative country compared to its neighbors. It makes sense that it's all the way to the right geographically because, frankly, it's all the way to the right conservative. The death of Tsar Alexander I is a big problem for the Russians because Alexander I was well-loved, man. He beat Napoleon. By yow, he beat Napoleon. That's what he did. That's pretty hard to do. You know, no one else had managed to pull it off. And maybe the Russian winter beat Napoleon, but Alexander's happy to take credit for the victory. The death leads to a muddled succession. Now, next in line to the throne is Constantine, a known reformer, but Constantine does not want the job, and he quietly steps aside in favor of his younger brother Nicholas, who becomes Tsar. A group of reformers called the Decembrists, because the revolt happens in, that's right, December, rose up against Nicholas I and eventually had to be squashed by a combined Russian and Austrian force. Why is this in the conservative column, Holiday? It seems like a radical movement because the victory here goes to the conservatives. The Austrians and the Russians, sort of the safeguarders of real conservative, old school, pre-1789 thinking, come in and smack that rebellion down and basically try and stop any conservative thinking from flourishing in their countries. Moving over slightly to the left, the liberals. Now, a 19th century liberal is an individual who believes that we need to have voting rights, but only for middle-class males, because if you start handing out the vote to every person in the society, that's going to lead to the common man rule, and that's dangerous. The 19th century liberal would also tell you that we need free speech and the freedom of the press and freedom of religion. And the reason we need those things is so that society can fully develop and flourish. If you limit those things, John Stuart Mill would tell you, you're going to have a society that's completely underdeveloped and not harnessing its resources as best as it can. So 19th century liberalism is an idea that really focuses around a lot of enlightened thinking. 19th century liberals would point to that first phase of the French Revolution, the moderate phase of the revolution, and say that was done right. A little bit of change, but not too much, slow and gradual push to the left. And no country personifies that as well as Great Britain. The British are the masters of just a little bit of change. Just a little bit. All right. Yes. Shall I have a crumpet? Oh, no, not a crumpet. I say, old man. That's some Britishness. I hope that worked. But a few British pieces of moderate reform. Not too much, just a little bit. The Reform Act of 1832. The Reform Act of 1832 does a couple things. Number one, it grants the right to vote to more middle-class men. The more middle-class men you get to vote, the less angry, non-voting middle-class men you have. Less likely you are to have a revolution. Pretty smart move. And then they also redistributed the seats of parliament, something the English hadn't done in hundreds of years. And by doing so, they recognized the rising tide of industrialization. You had portions of the country, Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds, Newcastle, where the real population of Britain was living, and there were no parliamentary representatives from there. And on the other hand, you had portions of England, like the Deep South, where no one lived anymore. People lived there, but not in huge population centers, and so therefore they leveled the playing field, which was good. They also passed a number of factory acts to try and make life safer for children in the factory. And they passed a law banning the Corn Laws. Now, this one takes a little more explaining. The Corn Laws were this pretty archaic set of rules that made it very difficult for foreign grain to get into the English market and compete against the English product. Now, what does that mean? That means that this English grain grower, let's call him Lord Grain Grower can raise the prices of his grain as high as he wants to without getting to a certain level, because he knows that there's no foreign competition to bring that price down. And as long as Lord Grain Grower has no foreign competition, he can really control the price point. Getting rid of the Corn Laws is a good thing because it takes the power away from Lord Grain Grower and assures that people get a free market choice in the price of their grains. Now, we talk here about the Irish potato famine a little bit because had the Corn Laws been revoked earlier than they were, 1846, it would have meant that the people in Ireland, dying and starving and unfortunately unable to get anything to eat besides potatoes, which weren't working out for them, might have had something else to eat. So for them, the revocation of the Corn Laws is a little bit too late. Let's go to the radical column, all the way to the left. Now, the radicals are individuals who are going to be seen by both the right and the moderate left as being just crazy. But we're talking here about people who think that every man should vote, and maybe the women too. Holy moly, crazy! These are socialists. These are people who want to see the society completely pulled to the left. Now, as a sign of the fact that we as a society today are more to the left, someone who's a radical in the 19th century is not a radical in the 21st century, right? If someone said, I believe women should have the right to vote, that's not radical today. That's kind of, yes, that's what we have. We don't have full-on socialism, but I think we have socialism in many forms of our government system. In the 19th century, anyone advocating that level of government involvement would have been like, whoo, you're crazy. We go down to the bottom here and we talk about the Romantics. The Romantics aren't what you think they're going to be some of the time, right? You think a romantic's going to be all lovey-dovey and fun stuff. But no, a romantic is an individual who passionately believes that we need to get away from the rational, logical, scientific, stodgy society of Europe. We need to go back to the intuitive, emotional things that can guide a person. There's this deep love of the individual and fighting against odds, I should say. And there's this belief that human beings should get out there and push themselves. There's this enormous connection with the Romantics with nature, because nature is in essence this flourishing, not opponent necessarily, but force of society that cannot be denied. Get out in nature and enjoy it. We talked about a few individuals, the German author Goethe. That's how long it is. Goethe writes Faust, which is about a guy who's willing to sell his soul to the devil to find success, right? Dare greatly. Caspar David Friedrich and these fantastic paintings with fog and people out. And it's unclear and they can't see. And it's like, ooh, that's where you find your soul, right? You don't find your soul in the middle of the Encyclopedia Britannica. You find it on a mountain, covered in fog, shrouded in fog. Shrouded. That's a good word. Okay, Delacroix at the top of the next page. Delacroix is a French artist who, when he paints about political struggle, always this idea of people chancing their lives in order to better their political goals. We finished off with the 1848 revolutions. Now, 1848 is this year where it all looks like it is going to come to an end for conservative Europe. This is it. In 1848, there are significant revolutions around Europe, and it looks like the old order, the conservative, stodgy, hold on, pillars of society, Edmund Burke, Metternich Europe is going to die. And it doesn't. Midway through the summer, it looks like it's over. And then Because the liberal left cannot find a way to galvanize support amongst itself, the conservatives swoop in to live another day. So let's look at two countries in particular, France and Austria. In France, there's a variety of factors going on here. There's a middle class that is enraged by a lack of reform, and then there's a working class that's angry because, frankly, they don't have any food or jobs. And they decide to join a revolution together. Now, this is a revolution that affords a number of different things, but the most controversial of which are these national workshops. The working classes want a guaranteed job. And early on, the middle classes abide by this. They give in to the working classes because they really need the support of the working classes for their government. And so they start creating these national workshops. And then the people start flooding into the cities like goodness knows what. And suddenly the working classes begin to realize we need more and more jobs. There's not enough jobs. And the middle classes think, oh my God, how many people are there? How many of these jobs do they need? And the middle class people have a moment of complete terror where they begin to think we have, to reference my former videos, got a tiger by the tail here. We have a group of individuals who cannot be controlled. And so we need to get out of this. And they fall back to a standard bearer of absolute rule, but familiar name, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. Okay, and Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, jumps into the situation and uses the army to scatter the working classes and restores order in name of the middle class and takes over France. And in a moment, as I said, that looked like the middle classes were going to have this huge liberal victory. What you get really is a conservative victory, not a liberal one. Let's look at Austria. Austria is a different scenario in that Austria has always been a bit of a fiery spot. It's a polyglot, so many different cultures raging against one another. And in the shadow of the French 1848 revolution, the Austrians have a revolution on their hands at the hands of the Hungarians. The Hungarians rise up and demand equal rule with the Austrians, and they want independence, and they want to be able to take territories with them. And the sticking point becomes that the Hungarians are foolish enough to try and treat all of the little minority countries within Austria the same way that the Austrians were treating them. You would think someone would have learned from that, but they didn't. The Hungarians tried to break away and take these little minority states with them and tried to force upon them their Hungarian or Magyar culture, which was a bad idea because, frankly, these are people who thought, well, hold on, if Hungary gets its freedom, why don't we get our freedom? And so eventually the debates, or not debates, but more of a clash between the forces of Hungary and the minority countries caused such turmoil and havoc that the Russians come to town and set order straight. The Russians, that's right, as they return favor from the Decembrist movement of roughly 20 years before, where the Austrians went to Russia to restore order, and now the Russians have come back. You see, they got each other's back like that. They're squad goals. Peace out. Now, I just did that in favor of absolutism and crushing revolts. That's not good. I hope you're doing well. Have a good night, folks.